Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So I recently, and by recently I mean this week, started a personal curriculum. I'm actually starting two. One of them is about Greek literature and just ancient Greece in general, and the other one is about Gothic literature. And for this personal curriculum, the first book that I decided to read is The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. I'm reading this first because this is considered to be the first Gothic novel. I read this after doing some research, video essay watching, and reading about what a Gothic novel is considered to be, the characteristics of it, the origins of the Gothic movement. So I had a bit of background about that before going into this. I honestly really did enjoy my experience reading this novel. I will say I did have to tandem read it with the audio. I got the audiobook from my library. It's only 4 hours. I'm pretty sure you can find one on YouTube too because this is public domain. Main reason is the way that it's told. I'm trying to show you. Paragraphs extremely long. The way dialogue is written feels kind of nonsensical. Well, it's sensical in like the way that it took me 2 chapters to get used to the way dialogue was written. If you cannot take the way Sally Rooney writes dialogue, you will not be able to understand the way he writes dialogue. I said to a friend who I told I was reading this, I said, thank God I love Sally Rooney because the way she writes dialogue with no quotations, I think prepared me for reading this. Not only are there no quotations, there's also barely any differentiating between who's speaking. The main indicator being M dashes, but people also speak and use M dashes within their sentences. So yeah, that was very confusing. However, it was a lot easier to keep my attention and follow who was saying what and just the general... Sorry, my mom just texted me. Yeah, just tandem reading it with the audio helped me keep my focus and helped me be able to follow the story more. This is not a good intro to classics book. This text is definitely harder to follow if you're not used to one, old language, and also just in general, I think it will be harder to follow. However, I really did enjoy the story and I did have a good time reading this. The story itself takes place in Naples, Italy. I think it's Naples. In the Middle Ages. It follows Manfred. He's a prince. He's the prince of Otranto, which is this big castle. He's married to a woman named Hippolyta. I'll put it on the screen right here. Hippolyta. I heard it said in the audiobook about 1,000,000 times and I still don't remember how to pronounce it. Anyway, that's his wife. He has 2 children, Conrad and Matilda. It opens up on the day of Conrad's wedding. Conrad is getting married to Isabella. On the day of the wedding, Conrad tragically dies. Manfred had a lot of affection for Conrad and kind of ignored Matilda. After Conrad's death, like immediately after his death, Manfred seeks out Isabella and is like, hey, I'm gonna marry you now. His reason for marrying Isabella is he needs another male heir so as to not fulfill this prophecy. The prophecy, let me read it to you, that the castle and lordship of Otranto should pass from the present family whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it. When we're first introduced to that prophecy, we don't understand much like what it means. What we're given in context of that prophecy is that he wants his son to marry quick and he wants a male heir to carry on his family because he doesn't want the castle to pass out of his family and he's trying to avoid this prophecy coming true. Some of the context that I read about before reading the book in the introduction of this edition, this is the Oxford World Classics edition. This is my first Oxford World Classics. I'm usually partial to a Penguin Black book. However, I did enjoy reading this version. Horace Walpole, he lived from 1717 to 1797. He was born in London. He went to Eton and King's College, Cambridge. He had a seat in Parliament before returning from his tour. And his home, which was titled Strawberry Hill, was actually renovated to fit the Gothic style. I'm gonna read a bit from the introduction, mainly the first page about the context of the book and how it was received. I'm sorry if you hear that, that is my dog barking. The Castle of Otranto is generally considered to be the first Gothic novel, and yet many modern readers find it by turns ludicrous and unreadable. I understand that the way it is written, like I said earlier, harder to follow. Again, had to tandem read it with the audio so that way I had a good reading experience. This first paragraph, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. It went into how the literary effects of this first Gothic novel, because they were so overworked and used by later followers of the Gothic novel, a lot of the literary effects, while they first thrilled readers when they were written, have basically become cliches. The significance of dreams, the appearance of the animated dead, the prevalence of secret passages. The last sentence of this paragraph. reads, "The Castle of Otranto is a striking example of a book that by inaugurating a new style within a few years made itself obsolete." I find that interesting because I don't think this is the first Gothic novel that most readers read. It's definitely not the first that I've read. However, I did still find this enjoyable. I don't know as much as applicable, but this was definitely interesting to read to see how the devices and aspects of a Gothic novel were first set up within this book. Another sentence that I really liked, again from this first page: "The appearance of the Castle of Otranto on 24th December 1764 is best understood not as the first rudimentary attempt in a new genre or as the genesis of the Gothic literary tradition in English, but rather as the climax of 18th century discussion and debate about the Goths and Gothic." The Gothic novel and the Gothic style, so the term Gothic literature draws from the Gothic architecture style that was popular in the 18th century because there was this nostalgia for the Middle Ages, which makes sense why the Castle of Otranto is set in the Middle Ages. Another sentence from the introduction: "The Castle of Otranto was not only innovative but succeeded in shifting an entire paradigm. In the context of 18th century Gothic, Walpole's novel was a game changer. That was why it was so important and why 18th century readers read it in astonished awe." So I think what that introduction is trying to say is that this book held a lot more shock and awe when it was first released versus readers today kind of see it as a Gothic novel that maybe blends in with the others and is kind of hard to read, which it is. However, I did really enjoy it. From this point forward, I will be talking about the book in context with spoilers. If you haven't read the book and don't want to be spoiled, go read it. It's honestly a pretty quick read. In total, the actual text is only like 105 pages. So yeah, give this a read, then come back. Okay, so onto the spoilery section. A lot of the notes and like mental analysis I was doing while reading was in the context of aspects of Gothic literature and how they showed up in this book. So I took notes on a bunch of those, but an aspect that I also really paid attention to is the Gothic heroine, which I'll get more into in a little bit. The Gothic heroine is just very interesting to me and how she appears in different novels. So we're first introduced to the powerful central character, which is Manfred in this. In Gothic novels, you see a powerful centric character that often has a power over everyone, like a very strong power over everyone, like Cathy or Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre. In this book, that is Manfred. He is the Prince of Otranto. We see a lot how his control influences specifically the women in his family and around him, but also everybody in the story. The ancient prophecy is told to us on the first page. This kind of plays into the supernatural aspects as well as the past. In this book specifically, the past, what Ricardo did after Alfonso died, really is catching up to Manfred. This ancient prophecy that the lordship of Otranto will pass from the family is haunting Manfred. It's haunting the narrative. It might have just been me while reading it, but it wasn't until chapter 3, or no, it was the end of chapter 2, where I kind of realized about the prophecy. I said, oh, Manfred isn't the real owner and descendant of Otranto. I wrote on the page, end of chapter 2, "Are Jerome and Theodore the true heirs? Bianca says Theodore looks exactly like Alfonso. The prophecy specifically differentiates the present family from the real owner." And that didn't click into my head, like the prophecy specifically differentiating the present family and the real owner, until after I read this chapter, and I was like, hold on. And then throughout the next 3 chapters, there's only 5 chapters in the book, the fact that Theodore looks exactly like Alfonso is brought up several times. Manfred at one point sees Theodore in armor and is like, that's the ghost of Alfonso. Why is the ghost of Alfonso here? Again, with the past haunting Manfred and following the narrative until they catch up to each other at the end. Another aspect of Gothic literature that I really thought about in context of the Castle of Otranto is there is the aspect of the castle, which in Gothic literature, it doesn't have to be a castle. It's just a building of great significance that holds that eerie feeling that centers the story, that the story is kind of centered around. In Wuthering Heights, it's Wuthering Heights. Talking to a friend this week how in Interview with the Vampire, the TV show, not as much the book. I don't see a central place in Interview with the Vampire as much in the book, but I definitely see it in the TV show. In season 1, it's the 1132 Rue Royale, and in season 2, it's the theater. So the castle is literally the castle of Otranto. Which I just found interesting. It's literally the castle. I find also the portrayal of the supernatural in this super interesting. So in the prophecy, it says whenever the real owner should be grown too large to inhabit it. the castle. And we're constantly seeing this vision where usually servants and maids throughout the castle are seeing this giant, not in its full form, but it's a hand. Bianca sees the giant's hand at the end of the book, or Diego seeing the foot. That was interesting to me, how we never really saw the giant, but it said that the giant was in the castle. The giant was growing and appearing as Theodore got to the castle. Theodore was arrested by Manfred on the day of Conrad's wedding, and this is when we're first starting to hear about the giant. Also, the literal ghost of Alfonso appears to Jerome in the book, so we see a literal ghost. Had to map out the characters' family trees. You can't see that. I had to map out the characters' literal family trees, especially towards the end when we were figuring out how Friar and Theodore were related to Alfonso. Theodore is descendant from Alfonso from his mom's side. I don't know if his mom is that daughter that Alfonso had secretly, or if his mom is a descendant from that daughter, but he is descendant from Alfonso through his mom's side, making him the true heir to Otranto. We have Manfred and Hippolyta, they had Conrad and Matilda, and then Frederick was the Marquis of Vicenza, who was the dad to Isabella, who's meant to marry Conrad at the beginning. It's important to note that Isabella and Manfred's family were sort of warring, but so were the families of Theodore and Manfred's family. Can kind of see that influence from Shakespeare, the Romeo and Juliet of it all, especially at the end when Matilda dies while she's secretly talking to Theodore. You can definitely see that Shakespearean influence. An important figure and character that we see throughout the story is St. Nicholas. He just stood out to me a lot in his influence over the story, especially like his tie to the ancient prophecy, his tie to the town and to religion. Otranto's church is dedicated to St. Nicholas, and everybody in the town prays to St. Nicholas. And so the story is, after Ricardo was shipwrecked, he prays for his survival in return for a church and two convents. I wrote it down so I don't miss anything. And then St. Nicholas agreed, but Ricardo's family's reign will end when the rightful heir grew too large for the castle, which is the prophecy. So the prophecy comes from St. Nicholas. He appeared to the hermit that Frederick found in the Joppa forest and showed him where to find the sword, which is how the second sort of prophecy. I looked into St. Nicholas because I'm not really Catholic. I'm assuming that the St. Nicholas in the book is based off the actual St. Nicholas in Catholicism, the Bishop of Myra from the 4th century. This is how we get the Santa Claus myth. He's known for giving gifts to the poor and acts of kindness. He was very popular during the Middle Ages, which makes sense again in context of the Gothic and the nostalgia for the Middle Ages back then. He was popular during the Middle Ages because his bones were moved from time to time, and every time they were moved, it stirred up more popularity for him. So St. Nicholas as a character kind of hovering over the story, coming up more and more, especially as they get closer to the prophecy coming to fruition. My favorite character was Matilda, which is our Gothic heroine here. The Gothic heroine is kind of like the virtuous young woman. The Gothic heroine is differential to parental figures, but is also very concerned with living life the right way, like the correct way, the proper way. Matilda is relentlessly ignored by her father. He tries to marry her off to an old man, literally killed by her father, but she continuously is faithful to him. On her deathbed, she is begging God and her mother to forgive her father for killing her, even though he didn't really do shit for her or like anything in her best interest. On page 85, we kind of get some foreshadowing for her death. Hippolyta says to Matilda, "Thy fate depends on thy father." And I wrote in the margins, oh, theme for Gothic heroine, especially in Matilda's case, she really wants to live by what's right for her father. Thy fate depends on thy father. Her fate is literally brought to her by her father. In this context, on page 85, they're talking about marriage. Matilda's like, I'm not gonna marry Frederick. I won't marry anybody. Send me to the convent. And Hippolyta says, thy fate depends on thy father. Her fate in marriage depended on her father. Her father was doing that bidding, but her father also killed her. So yeah, as soon as I saw that line, I was like, oh yeah, this is so Matilda, just like, this is very her, but it was very her in the end. I also really liked, this is very macabre to say, but I very much so liked how they described her death as she expired. Literally just but I wanna be Isabella Theodore for my sake. Oh, she expired. That's her death. She was a very interesting character to me. Her father was a tyrant who only cared about himself. He divorced his wife because she couldn't bear heirs, because the worst thing that could happen to him was that he would be ousted from this castle. Did not care about the well-being of his wife. He did not care about the well-being of Matilda until the very end. I want to say he cared about Conrad, but I don't know if that's just because he was his heir. He doted on Conrad, but not as much Matilda. Closing thoughts. I had a good time reading this. I haven't read or watched anybody else's analysis on this, mainly because I wanted to keep my thoughts my own for this video. Again, I literally read this today, but I really enjoyed reading this, and I'm really excited to watch the Gothic genre grow, essentially, through my personal curriculum, and reading this was really fun, especially like studying it in context with the Gothic movement, what we already know about Gothic novels 250 years later. So yeah, if you want to see more videos like this as I read more books from my personal curriculum, make sure to subscribe if you like the video, like it, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!